Welcome back to the Unintentional Heretic. Today we're stepping into territory that for some people may feel unsettling, maybe even dangerous, because we're going to talk about the evolution of the biblical understanding of God. And if this idea makes you uncomfortable, let me say this clearly. Studying the development of theology does not weaken faith. If anything, it can deepen it. Because the Bible is not a single frozen moment of theology dropped out of heaven fully formed. It's a library, a collection of writings spanning centuries, different authors, different contexts, different agendas, different levels of understanding. And one of the things I love most about Scripture is that it's honest enough to preserve growth, tension, disagreement, and evolution. The Bible doesn't hide the growth of faith, it preserves it. And honestly, I think that matters a lot because many of us inherited a view of the Bible that treated theology as static and unchanging, as though Abraham, Moses, Isaiah, Paul, and Jesus all had identical understandings of God, but they didn't. The story of Scripture is, in many ways, the story of humanity slowly awakening to deeper understandings of divine reality. Or as the theologian John Cobb once said, revelation is not the delivery of information from heaven, but the ongoing encounter between God and humanity. And I think that's exactly what we see unfolding in Scripture. So today we're going to explore a fascinating question. Where did Yahweh come from? And how did a small, tribal, warrior deity eventually become understood as the infinite ground of all being, the cosmic Christ, the source of all reality itself? And before we go further, I want to express real gratitude to Dr. Justin Sledge and his incredible YouTube channel, Esoterica. If you've never watched his work, it is one of the most best academically grounded resources online for exploring ancient religion, mysticism, the occult, early Judaism, and the development of religious thought. Dr. Sledge constantly reminds viewers ancient religion was fluid, dynamic, and deeply interconnected. And honestly, that insight alone changes how we read the Bible, because Israel did not emerge in a vacuum. Ancient Israel was a part of the ancient Near East, a world filled with gods, temples, divine families, and competing cosmologies. And in that world, people generally did not ask which God exists. That was assumed. The question was which God protects us because gods were territorial, functional, relational. There were gods of storms, of fertility, gods of mountain, gods of war. And evidence strongly suggests that Yahweh originally emerged as a southern storm warrior deity associated with places like Edom, Midian, Seir, and Paran. Some of the oldest poetry in the Hebrew Bible actually says this directly. Listen to Judges 5. Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom, the earth trembled. Or in the book Habakkuk, God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. These are some of the oldest texts in the Bible linguistically. Scholars recognize this partly through the evolution of Hebrew itself, much like we can distinguish between modern English from Old English. And in these earliest depiction, Yahweh appears as a storm god, a warrior, a marching deity emerging from the wilderness in power. And now here's where things get really fascinating. When Israel enters Canaan, there's already an established pantheon there. And at the top of that pantheon is a god named El. El was the high god, the wise father figure, creator, ancient king of heaven. And many titles later associated with Yahweh originally belonged to El. El Elyon, God Most High, El Shaddai, the God bull imagery. In fact, Abraham himself worships El Elyon in Genesis 14. And El presides over something called the divine council, a heavenly assembly of divine beings. This worldview shows up clearly in the oldest recoverable version of Deuteronomy 32 found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It says, when the Most High divided the nations, he fixed the boundaries according to the number of the sons of God. But Yahweh's portion was Israel. Think about that for a moment. The text imagines a high God distributing nations among lesser divine beings with Yahweh receiving Israel. That's not modern monotheism. That's something scholars call monolatry, meaning worship of one God without denying the existence of others. And again, I know for some people this feels shocking because we inherited the assumption that biblical religion was always strict monotheism from the beginning. But historically, that's simply not what the evidence suggests. Biblical scholar Mark S. Smith writes, early Israelite religion was not originally distinct from the religions of its Canaanite neighbors. Now, alongside El was another major deity, Baal. Now, Baal was the storm god, the fertility god, the divine warrior who defeats chaos. And this explains something important. Why Baal becomes Yahweh's primary rival in the Old Testament, because they occupied similar theological territory. They were both storm gods, both associated with rain, thunder, battle, power over chaos. The conflict between Yahweh and Baal wasn't random, it was theological overlap. Now, over time, something remarkable happens. Yahweh and El begin merging. The titles of El become the titles of Yahweh, the creator God, the father figure, the Most High. Distinct traditions slowly fuse together, and the Bible preserves traces of this evolution. Exodus 6 even has God say, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name Yahweh I was not known to them. In other words, different generations encountered God differently, under different names, with different understandings. And eventually those experiences become integrated into one larger vision of divine reality. What I love about this is that Scripture doesn't erase the earlier layers, it preserves them. The Bible is less like a systematic theology textbook and more like an archaeological dig site, layer upon layer upon layer. Now, politically, Israel eventually divides into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and Judah in the south. And they develop different theological emphases. The north preserves older traditions, including bull imagery associated with El, which changes how we read the story of the golden calf. Historically, that story may not originally have been about abandoning Yahweh entirely. It may have been about competing understandings of Yahweh worship itself. Again, theology evolves through political struggle, cultural tension, and reinterpretation. And then comes one of the greatest crises in Israel's history, the Babylonian exile. Jerusalem falls, the temple is destroyed, the people are dragged into Babylon. And this creates a theological earthquake because in the ancient world, gods were understood as landlocked. Defeat your people, defeat their God. So now Israel has to wrestle with the devastating question, has Yahweh been defeated? And the answer emerges through one of the strangest visions in the Bible, Ezekiel 1. Wheels within wheels, eyes everywhere, a throne chariot moving through the heavens. And the revolutionary message is this, God is not confined to geography. God is mobile, universal, cosmic. This changes everything. The exile transformed Yahweh from a territorial deity into a universal God of all creation. And eventually, true monotheism emerges clearly in texts like Isaiah, I am God and there is no other. That's actually a late development, a profound one. The old divine beings don't fully disappear, though. They get reclassified. Some become angels, some become demons, some become powers and principalities. You even see echoes of this old divine council in Psalm 82. It says, God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. And then says, you are gods, but you will die like mortals. And this is a theological transition happening in real time. The old gods are being demoted. Authority is being centralized. And eventually Christianity inherits this entire trajectory. But then Christianity does something utterly shocking. The infinite cosmic God becomes incarnate, not in Caesar, not in empire, not in domination, but in Jesus. And the arc of God continues evolving from tribal warrior to universal creator to crucified love. As Richard Rohr says, the history of religion is the history of the widening of God. And maybe that's what we're witnessing throughout Scripture itself, a widening. Many gods becoming one, a land-based deity becoming cosmic, a tribal protector becoming the ground of all being. And eventually, in the New Testament, Christ becomes the image of the invisible God through whom all things hold together, the cosmic Christ, not merely tribal, not merely national, but universal. And honestly, I think this matters enormously for our spiritual lives today. Because if God has patiently grown humanity's understanding over centuries, what if God is still growing us? What if evolution is not a threat to faith, but the very mechanism through which revelation unfolds? Teilhard de Chardin once wrote, we are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. And perhaps the story of Scripture is humanity slowly waking up to that reality. Not all at once, but gradually, generation after generation, which leaves us with a question worth sitting with. If God has been willing to grow with humanity across centuries, what might God still be growing us towards now?